Most people who will be displaced by AI will not see it coming, not because they were not paying attention, but because they were measuring the wrong thing. They were watching headlines about which industries are at risk when the actual question is far more surgical than that. Which specific tasks in your specific role are replaceable, and how much of your paycheck depends on them. That is what this video teaches you to measure, calmly, precisely, in about an hour. Here is what makes this hard to figure out on your own. When you read a study that says accountants are 70% likely to be automated, that number is an average across every accountant at every company doing every version of that job. It tells you almost nothing about you. A tax preparer running the same software workflow every February is in a completely different position than a CFO who spends her days translating messy business reality into financial strategy. Same job title, wildly different exposure. The industry-level numbers are not useless, but they are the beginning of the question, not the answer. So how do you actually measure your own exposure? You start with what researchers call task decomposition. The idea is simple. Your job is not a single thing. It is a collection of discrete tasks, some of which AI can already do, some of which it cannot, and some of which it is getting closer to every quarter. When you break your role down to its actual components and ask honestly which bucket each one falls into, the picture becomes a lot clearer. And sometimes it is more reassuring than you expected. Sometimes it is more alarming. Either way, you are now working with real information instead of ambient dread. Here is how to do it. Take a blank document and spend 20 minutes writing down every repeatable task you do in a given month. Not your job description, not your LinkedIn summary. The actual work. Summarizing data from reports. Answering the same 10 types of client questions. Scheduling and coordinating across teams. Building slide decks from templates. Reviewing contracts for standard clauses. Drafting first versions of emails or proposals. Writing status updates. Whatever fills your actual days. Be granular. If you vaguely write down communications as one item, you will miss the distinction between the tasks that are already being done by language models and the tasks that still require genuine human judgment about specific relationships and contexts. Get it on the page first, then we can assess it. Once you have your list, you are going to run each task through 3 filters. The first filter is routine versus adaptive. A routine task follows a predictable pattern each time. Given the same inputs, the output is roughly the same. Formatting a monthly report, pulling numbers from a database and summarizing them, processing invoices. These are high-exposure tasks. AI handles predictable pattern work extremely well, and the cost of AI doing it is dropping every year. An adaptive task requires reading new information, adjusting your approach, and making judgment calls that depend on context. Advising a client who just got unexpected news, managing a team member through a conflict, diagnosing why a project is actually stalling when the official reason does not add up. These are lower exposure, not zero, but lower. The second filter is whether your task requires proprietary context. This is something the headline studies almost never capture. There is a huge difference between a task that can be done with public information and a task that requires deep institutional knowledge. If you are the person who understands why this particular client behaves the way they do, why this internal process works the way it does despite being technically illogical, why this stakeholder needs to hear things framed a certain way, that knowledge is not in any training data set. It lives in your head and your relationships. Tasks that depend on it are structurally harder to automate, even when the surface-level output looks similar to something a model could produce. The third filter is the one most people skip, and it is probably the most important. What percentage of your recognized value, meaning what your manager or your clients actually point to when they justify your salary or your contract, comes from each category of task? Because you might discover that you spend 60% of your time on highly automatable tasks, but that those tasks account for almost none of the reason anyone considers you valuable. Or you might discover the opposite, that the 1 or 2 things that make you genuinely hard to replace are actually things you have been quietly deprioritizing because the routine work always feels urgent. That gap between where your time goes and where your value is perceived to come from is the most actionable insight this exercise produces. Let me give you a concrete example. A project manager at a mid-sized firm went through this exercise and found that about half of her weekly hours went to status reporting, scheduling, and meeting follow-ups. She had always assumed those tasks were central to her value. But when she asked herself honestly what her leadership team actually cited when they talked about her, it was always her ability to sense when a project was going sideways before the data showed it kick in her skill at managing difficult vendor relationships. The routine coordination work was necessary, but not the source of her leverage. That realization did two things. It told her that her exposure was lower than she feared, because her real value was in exactly the kind of contextual judgment AI does not handle well, and it told her she had been spending her best hours on the wrong things. She started delegating and automating more of the coordination work and reinvesting that time in the judgment-heavy work. Her visibility inside the organization went up. Her exposure went down, both at once. Here is what nobody tells you about this process. The goal is not to find that you are perfectly safe. The goal is to find out exactly where your exposure is so you can do something about it before you are forced to. The people who will land well through this transition are not the ones who happen to be in the right role. They are the ones who understood their own task profile clearly enough to make deliberate moves. That might mean consciously building more of the skills that live in your lower exposure tasks. It might mean positioning yourself differently inside your organization so that your recognized value matches your actual value. It might mean adding an income stream that gives you runway. But all of those moves start with the same thing, an honest map of where you actually stand. One more thing worth knowing, your exposure is not static. AI capabilities are moving, and so is the composition of your role. A task that was fully adaptive 2 years ago, say, drafting a first-pass report from raw data, might be mostly routine today. This is not a one-time audit. It is a lens you develop, and once you have it, you will apply it automatically whenever you take on new responsibilities or see a new tool enter your space. That ongoing situational awareness is itself a form of career leverage. You stop being surprised. If you want a structured way to start this without staring at a blank page, I built a free audit tool. It walks you through the task decomposition and filtering process we covered here, and it gives you a clear read on where your role sits. The link is below. It takes about 15 minutes. No email required. You will come out of it knowing something specific, which is a different feeling than the vague unease most people are carrying around about this. That is the whole point.